Part 1. The Whisper in the Canvas. They said his portraits breathed, that they followed you with their eyes long after you'd left the room. Some whispered he captured not just appearances but the very souls of his subjects. Others claimed he painted secrets his models never told. But the truth about John Singer Sargent was more complicated than myth. It was a life carved between light and shadow, elegance and controversy, brilliance and obsession. He was born in Florence, Italy in 1856, a child of wanderers. His American parents, displaced by the death of two older children, roamed Europe with grief as their compass. Art, beauty, history, they sought refuge in culture, dragging John from city to city, from gallery to gallery. Even as a boy, he drew not like a child but like someone possessed. He sketched ruins with aching detail, faces with unnatural maturity. There was something feverish in his need to record the world. At 13, his talent was undeniable. At 18, he entered the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, where he absorbed the discipline of academic painting but resisted its constraints. He trained under Carolus Duran, a flamboyant master who taught him to sculpt with paint, to mold light across flesh like a god. Sargent learned to dance with his brush. But beneath that elegance, something darker stirred. It was during these years that he met his first true muse, not a woman but the idea of perfection. Every stroke had to be flawless. Every canvas, a mirror of unseen truths. He began to haunt the streets of Montmartre, staring too long at strangers, asking to paint the poor, the mad, the beautiful. He wasn't looking for models, he was chasing spirits. His fame began with praise. Commissions rolled in. He painted aristocrats, industrialists, and socialites with dazzling precision. Yet something about his work unsettled people. His subjects looked too alive, too exposed. As if they had been stripped of masks they didn't know they wore. And then came Madame X. She stood there, pale and commanding, her black satin dress clinging like a second skin, one jeweled strap sliding daringly off her shoulder. The portrait, unveiled at the Paris Salon in 1884, ignited scandal. Not for nudity but for audacity. For how Sargent had turned a society woman into an object of both worship and dissection. It destroyed her reputation. Nearly ruined his. But instead of retreating, Sargent fled. To London. To Venice. To the edges of society. And there, in the twilight between disgrace and reinvention, he began to evolve. The shadows in his work deepened. His brush grew looser, wilder, as if trying to exorcise something. John Singer Sargent wasn't just painting faces. He was hunting ghosts. Part 2. The Crisis of Flesh and Paint. By the late 1880s, Sargent was a man both celebrated and estranged. His portraits had become legendary in elite circles across Europe, yet he walked the streets of Paris and London with a restlessness that no acclaim could settle. The public saw him as the maestro of elegance, the conjurer of nobility's essence. But he was haunted by a question that only he could hear. Was he merely a mirror or a true creator? The scandal of Madame X still whispered through gallery walls like a lingering ghost. Though years had passed, Sargent felt its sting. It wasn't just the public's reaction that scarred him, it was the realization that the world preferred beauty over truth. He began to turn his gaze inward. Around this time, Sargent withdrew from society portraiture. He left the grand parlors behind and wandered through Venice, the Alps, and the Middle East, sketching not faces but shadows. Watercolors became his sanctuary. He painted stones, fountains, fishermen, slaves, and soldiers. These were not commissions. These were confessions. Each brushstroke seemed to slice through layers of his own repression. The vibrant fluidity of his watercolors stood in stark contrast to the rigidity of his portraits. With color, he spoke of solitude, of brokenness, of the unreachable divine. The brush no longer obeyed the desires of patrons, it obeyed the tremble of his soul. In one lonely villa in the Italian countryside, Sargent began work on what would become one of his most enigmatic pieces, the Fountain Villa Torlonia. The light danced like fireflies in the marble spray. It was as though he painted not the scene, but the very memory of its vanishing. And still he was not at peace. He wrote in a letter to a friend, "I feel I am painting ghosts, ghosts of myself, ghosts of silence." Even his studio began to reflect his transformation. The once orderly rooms filled with aristocratic sketches now resembled a storm's aftermath, canvases stacked in chaos, colors bleeding onto wooden floors, old portraits turned to face the walls. It was as though he was dismantling his own myth stroke by stroke. He refused offers from kings. He turned down titles. He painted peasants instead of princesses. And in every wrinkled hand, every bowed back, he found a fragment of his own fractured soul. But the world would not let him go quietly. In America, his murals for the Boston Public Library rekindled his fame. Yet even in grandeur, Sargent's unease seeped through. The triumph of religion was not a celebration. It was an interrogation. Divine figures loomed like judges. Light fell like judgment. Silence echoed louder than choirs. Critics called it magnificent. He called it unbearable. When asked why he no longer painted portraits, Sargent once muttered, "Every face is a mask, and I am tired of painting lies." Thus, in middle age, John Singer Sargent found himself at a crossroads, not between success and failure but between illusion and truth. He had seen both sides of beauty, the adoration it commands and the isolation it conceals. And now, the man who had once been the toast of Europe, painted only for himself, and the ghosts that whispered in the quiet corners of his mind. Part 3, The Peak and the Price. By the dawn of the 20th century, John Singer Sargent was not just admired, he was revered. His portraits were the currency of the elite. His name alone drew gasps in drawing rooms and echoed through the halls of art academies. But at the peak of fame came fatigue. He had painted hundreds of portraits, duchesses wrapped in silk, politicians cloaked in pride, businessmen demanding legacy. Yet behind each commission lay a negotiation, a compromise, a version of truth shaped by what the sitter wished to see, not what Sargent felt. His brush began to rebel. He turned away from the grand, polished portraits, declined commissions, locked his studio. Whispers swirled. Was Sargent losing his touch? Was he ill? No. He was chasing something purer. He began painting for himself. Watercolors, landscapes, studies of light dancing on Venetian canals, forgotten corners of Spanish gardens. Scenes alive not with opulence but with motion, color, breath. He traveled endlessly, Venice, the Alps, the Middle East. With each trip he collected not souvenirs but silence. The freedom to see not be seen. But fame like a shadow follows close behind. Exhibitions of his watercolors sold out. Critics called him a genius again. But now, it stung. The moment he freed himself, the world applauded. Was he ever truly free? Final the silent canvas. By the time he entered his final decade, John Singer Sargent had become a paradox. The most celebrated portraitist who no longer wished to paint portraits. A man who could command the world's attention but yearned for solitude. In his modest studio in London, once overflowing with aristocrats and chatter, now only the murmur of wind through the curtains remained. He painted light now, not faces. The glitter of Spanish courtyards, the hush of olive groves, the chaos of Moroccan marketplaces. Color, texture, movement, it all became a language more honest than words. Those who knew him in his final years described him as distant, but not cold. He had seen too much. He had felt too much. He rarely spoke of regrets. But once quietly to a close friend he muttered, "All my life I painted what others wanted to remember. But now I paint what I wish not to forget." He died in his sleep in 1925. No final masterpiece. No dramatic last brushstroke. Just stillness. A quiet passing, like the fade of a final note in a forgotten sonata. But his legacy was anything but silent. Today, his portraits hang in gilded halls, his watercolors ripple with life in quiet corners of museums. His influence echoes through generations of artists who learn not just to paint, but to see. And perhaps that is his true masterpiece. Not Madame X or the Royal Commissions, not even the blazing watercolors of Venice, but the unseen work, the lifelong struggle of a man who walked the thin line between brilliance and burden, society and solitude, performance and authenticity. His soul was not in the eyes of his sitters, but in the shadows between brushstrokes. In the refusal to be claimed. In the silence of a man who painted the world, but was never quite part of it. And if you listen closely, somewhere between the rustle of silk and the stillness of stone, you might still hear him breathing through his canvases, not as a ghost but as a whisper. A whisper that says, "Look closer. I was always more than what you saw."